Vladimir, добрый день, спасибо, что...
Good day, Vladimir. Thank you for finding time to join our channel today. I suggest we address the economic news that are hitting our radar, and one is more interesting than the other. For example, I saw a message that Russians are facing record non-payments on credit, and that has not been the case since the times of pandemic. Right now, about 800,000 of Russian citizens are at default with their consumer credit, and mortgage is even worse. Overall number is over 6.5 million that owe money one way or another in this country. How do you treat these numbers? Is it hitting new lows? Is it an indicator that people have serious, real problems with money? Yes, hello. First of all, it was very expected story. For several years, during which Russians were borrowing so actively to weather these difficult times, it was understood that at some point it will end, and it will end with a serious crisis of non-payments, personal bankruptcies, and like. I think that right now, of course, it is exacerbated due to the sky-high bank rates for the credits, and even though they could possibly drag it out for a bit longer with the older rates, but with this new rising rates by central bank and waterfalling to the other banks, this becomes intolerable and unmanageable. For example, the Federal Service of Court Bailiffs is telling that over 9 months the rate of cases, civilian cases, administrative cases for different forms of credit and debt, it grew by 34%. They have about 1.5 trillion rubles at default under court judgment right now, and I think this is only the harbingers of what actually will come later. Economic forecast is not getting brighter. It implies that the growth of salaries and income would be slowing down, and financial capabilities of people will be slowing even more, and that all on the backdrop of growing bank rates, which becomes absolutely unmanageable to sustain. And of course, this is a mixed picture. There are some credit that were taken on the fixed terms, and they do not feel the current rate that has risen, but definitely with the consumer credit and with those mortgages that have a flexible arm, then those people definitely feel the rising rates. And I think the 2025 will be a much more difficult year in this situation. The numbers that you're calling out at the beginning of this stream, that actually may look like something very basic, because there'll be more hardcore doom and gloom coming the next year. And I want to say that this was actually due to the directed policies, internal policies of Russian authorities, who were applauding their citizens taking more credit, who were cheering them to do that, to carry through the difficult years. But there is always coming the time of reckoning and the time to pay the debt, and right now they're already facing a situation where they're incapable. The first wave of those non-paid debts is here upon the consumers. And it will be a tragedy for millions of families who will have nothing to pay for the credit. Vlad, why is it happening so? Is it the consequences of war, the policies of the central bank, or systemic issues? I think this is due to the lack of honest leadership that would be honestly telling people what is happening in the country. Because since the beginning of war, when the first economic sanctions were applied to Russia, Russian authorities were saying that this is not for long. Our economy will weather that, we'll get back to growth. Sanctions in the West are not to fear. We do not care about them. We have other economic pathways. And that had some effect. Common citizens and some businessmen, they actually bought it line, hook, and sinker, and agreed that, okay, that these economic problems are probably not for long. We need just to weather that bit of a storm, get a bit more credit, and then the economy will be improving with some fantastic markers, milestones, and pace We don't need West, we have China, we have East, etc. And that's what I keep seeing looking at businesses, at physical persons, that a lot of them were taking it exactly that way, that they just need to weather some short period and they can take some credits and then the future growth will write it off, and import replacement with their own domestic production will ignite the growth of salaries, the growth of income, and they'll be able to pay these credits back. In my opinion, authorities had to tell people honestly. Unfortunately, in Russia, there is no such habit as honest leadership, as honest administration. They should be saying that this crisis is for a long time. We have no clue and no pathway. How do we get out of it? Probably in the observable future, we will see at some point the way out, but right now we do not. That's what they should be saying. I was leading this topic in my channel, in my streams. You can dig up the archives in 2019, 2020. I was flagging for Russian citizens that they should not be going to consumer credit pits, and they should be very careful with how they do mortgage. But at the same time, authorities were sending a reverse message. They were lying to their citizens to survive the current situation and economic issues they had already on the eve of this war. And people accumulated a pretty wild amount of credit. I can be a little slightly wrong with the numbers, but it is roughly way beyond 30 trillion rubles, the overall retail credit that Russian citizens have on their hands. And back 4 years ago, it was on the level of 20 trillion. So the growth of 30% just over a few months, that was such a huge credit boom that was happening in Russia. And they've been taking so much money that they need to pay now, especially during this war with Ukraine, believing that everything will come to an end soon and they will have some way to pay this off. But the moment central bank jerked up the rate, they are seeing that there is no perspective, that they cannot maintain and sustain the current situation. Inflation, Vlad, is another big fear that the citizens of Russia are facing now. And we see that some companies are already refusing to index their employees' salaries in accordance with the inflation. I understand it actually is written out in the laws somewhere, at least for the federal establishments. But official inflation, of course, is being declared to be much lower than the real inflation the citizens of Putin's Russia are facing. What is your estimation for this picture, for this aspect of economy? Well, 8 to 9% of annual inflation is considered to be a high inflation, and these are what official numbers of Putin's administration are showing. And I want to say that nothing even close to index the salaries of the budget workers to that rate is even in a budget anywhere. Pensions, I think it's somewhere at 5%, 4 to 5. This is significantly lower than the official inflation numbers. And if you look at the Russian stat numbers, since September of last year, real pensions are in negative, and they have not been indexed even to the official numbers of inflation that are confirmed by Putin's government. Similar situation in the whole federal sector, social workers, health, culture. We can see that over 9 months of this year, the salary growth was maybe at 13 to 14% in those cases where they were. And you also mentioned that official inflation is lagging behind the real one. I suggest everybody to check the agency Romir, how they measure the real inflation. This is a pretty ancient agency that's working in Russia since 90s of the past century, and they're researching consumer market. They have an interesting index. You can go to their website, romir.ru. They have an index of FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods. These are the daily use assortment, an average stuff you can find in your neighborhood supermarket. And they're giving an index of 22% for the last couple months in transferred to the annual equivalent. So it's not 8 or 9, it's 22% that the real inflation is for daily consumer goods. And indeed, employers are facing a more difficult time to index the salaries of their workers. And as we talked with several other stream hosts a few times already, that the salary chase, the race of salaries is over in Russia, because there's only so far you can jerk your salary up to try to get a specialist. And there are a lot of expenses rising. Logistics is at premium. Replacing imports from better and cheaper channels also costs more money. Inflation is also warmed up by excessive demand, government dumping and printing a lot more money into economy to support the military machine, but this is not supported by the growth of production and only results in the growth of prices. That's why the prices are growing for everything. And this, of course, gets reflected on the books of the companies, on their expenses. In return to that, central bank grows the refinance rate, and that in turn increases the expenses of the companies, those who borrow these money, of the banks. And meantime, they need to still find somewhere these profits to compensate for this interest growth. And they are at the place where it's difficult to do. They've already reached their limits. And this is what's well described by scenario stagflation. And you can start hearing this word very soon, plenty in Russian economic discussion. Recently, with a report predicting stagflation for Russia, Belousov Center of Macroeconomic Analysis came out and they published an interesting research. This was a company, an organization created by current Minister of Defense of Russia, and now his brother is running it. But they're actually outlining that indeed economy is characteristic of a high growth of prices, but the salaries are not growing and the productivity is not growing. So hoping that somehow salaries will keep the pace with inflation becomes a foregone dream. And as we talked about a crash landing of Russian economy for a couple of years already, it actually gets together to be a much rougher landing than some people thought. Oh, indeed, this is a very interesting report, and we can probably see the signs of direct fight between the Putin's government and the central bank. Where do you think this conflict will lead? Because the critique of each other is growing pretty harsh. Of course, it's understandable that when they're facing real-time difficulties that are caused by the war and Putinism in general, here we need to understand that they try to point fingers at each other, but the problem, the fundamental problem, is caused by war on one hand and by non-changing, non-see-through, non-transparent, very corrupt oligarchic Putin system that is devouring even the resources they had, shoving them in the pockets of oligarchs, and there is no growth of economy for the country. And on top of that, of course, the consequences of war are adding to the dire picture. But they cannot talk about that. This is verboten. This is prohibited in all state media, in any kind of media in Russia, even social networks. So they start pointing fingers at each other, and central bank is the most convenient target in this regard. But here I want to say at the get-go, there is no good way out. If we keep Putinism and war in the formula, there is no good option. So if central bank will continue rising the rate, everything will die. And this is the right critique from the government and the industrialists. On the other hand, if the central bank will do as they suggest and lower the rate without solving the basic core problems, there'll be a hyperinflation, just like at the beginning of the 90s, or like recently they had in Turkey or Argentina. Therefore, as long as the war ensues and there is a monopolist oligarchic system in existence in Russia, there'll be no good solution for this problem. And this infight of bulldogs under the carpet is already spilling from under the carpet. It is already in the visible space. And we'll observe more and more finger pointing and attacks within the administration at each other regarding who is to blame. I think that central bank actually has no chances in this situation, because those who demand lowering the rate and softening of the fiscal policies, they have serious lobby, money, and support. We saw in October that Sergei Chemezov was leading the attack against Nabiullina, the head of Rostech, the main beneficiary of this war, because Rostech is the biggest recipient of federal money for war, manufacturing munitions and vehicles and everything for this war. And right, he's also a very close person to Putin. Exactly, not simply close to Putin, but in my estimations, he is person number 2 in the current situation in Russia. He's a new Patrushev who is making all kinds of decisions or influencing them more than most others. And definitely he has a lot of money, a lot of industries on his side. There is war as well on his side, because this is something that Putin cherishes. If he wants to produce more arms to fight this war, he will be hearing what the industrialists are telling him. On the other hand, what does central bank have? They have about a year and a half of harsh fiscal policies of increasing the rate that actually did not achieve the results they were set to achieve. They're promising that their policies will work at some point, but the further it goes, the less convincing these discussions and these statements by Nabiullina become, including Putin's understanding of the situation. So if we talk at any distance about who is going to prevail in this conflict, I think it becomes very obvious that all the resources, all the influence on the side of those who are against the policies of central bank. And central bank really doesn't have to beat these cards with anything. Their rate is not quite working, the inflation is rising, and every day the belief and faith in their ability to control the situation, that somehow with monetary policies they can address it, there is less and less hope and faith left for that. And if you listen to what they say in their recent statements, they start to acknowledge that the main reasons for the growth of prices in Russia is not in fiscal policies. It's not in their court. The ball, actually, they're trying to send it back to the industrialists and to the war machine. And it's getting hotter. So recently, Kirill Trimasov was speaking at the forum, who is also representative of the fiscal system, who was saying that's not us, that's the budgetary influxes in the economy. We have nothing to be blamed for. This is the government that you have to blame. So the worse the situation gets, the more active mutual accusations that stream will become. But overall, central bank, in my estimation, has no chances to win. They will be given some runway to wobble a little and to try to do something, but very soon they'll have to change that, because otherwise the companies will just start going bankrupt. All right, let's leave these bulldogs under the carpet. Let's now focus on the usual citizens who are trying to save some money, who are trying to travel sometimes, who are trying to put food on the table. So now we're faced with the onset of winter, soon winter coming here. The prices for consumer goods, for food, actually rising. Butter is increasing significantly, about almost 30% since the beginning of this year. So is there a way they can stop the growth of the prices on some of these goods? I know that some Putin's partners and some of his inner oligarch circles are trying to bring in some goods, to import some goods from other sources and try to help Russian citizens with that. And right, some oil and butter they're actually bringing not even from Arab countries, but from finding ways to re-import from Ukraine, for example, from Vinnytsy district. Yeah, so indeed we have different groups of goods where this accumulated issue with cost of doing business does bubble up from time to time. And if we look at the discussion in the Russian business press about the reasons for the growth of prices for butter, they actually addressing the whole chain, starting with the cost of milk and other components of logistics and labor payments. So if you look at the whole chain of production, the prices are increasing. And they've been trying to hold them, but there is usually a time when it's impossible to hold it any longer. A year ago, we saw that in chickens and eggs. In spring, it was with veggies and fruit, which later was somewhat pacified during the summer season, but now there is a new wave upon the Russian economy. For example, last week, according to the data, we see potato prices have spiked by 65% since the beginning of the year. It's more than butter. Butter is only at 28, I think. So all these accumulated problems and the explosive growth of costs will continue rolling through all groups of goods. I think butter is not the last word in this. Milk products are already growing. Next, it'll be meat products, bread, everything. At some point, it will be affecting all kinds of consumer goods and food. And the problem of this is that Russia is in a serious international isolation. And yes, we can situationally import certain goods from the countries of so-called global south, but in order to create effective chain of production in Russia, the country needs effective technical components, effective foods for the animals from the countries that manufacture them in the most effective way. And we are cut off from most of those suppliers in the modern reality. So we only have access to the limited group of countries that can supply some items to Russia. And just if you lose the statistics here, most likely you'll see that that your most likely scenario is that everything will become more expensive. And that's what we're facing. Why milk products, for example, are suffering, and butter as a token product in this field. And the key reason there is sharp increase for milk prices, which then translates in a chain effect into butter. Agriculture and anything related to chickens and cows and goats and all these farm animals, and this is all affected by the investment climate because it takes years to grow that proverbial cow. And given the turbulence that exists on the market, those people who deal with these businesses, they were making a decision. Why the heck should we be investing long-term and growing these cows to produce milk? Let's invest into something that's more short-term, where you can get money right now and not wait 5 years before you get something which will be depreciated by the investment market. And in 5 years, you may even lose everything and lose your business as well. So that's too far of a horizon for planning. That's why many of them switch to a short-term business models. And that situation on the milk market is a direct result of a bad investment climate, which just became worse after beginning of this war, when Russia lost access to very important Western technologies. And if you're even 1/10 of an economist, would ask, how did you expect the prices to not grow? I would be seriously surprised if any prices were stable, and otherwise the situations we're facing now, absolutely normal. And butter is not the last product to spike. There'll be others that will be exploding. All the growth of costs will be spiking in the retail prices, so there's more to expect. All right, Vlad, let's talk a bit more about more chains in the food industry. What else is under threat? I think all agriculture that's related to growing crops will be affected by the climate this year. We see in a paradoxical way, remember how Putin was joking a while ago that global climate change is actually beneficial to Russia because we'll be saving money on fur and it will be warmer. But it turns out that whatever climate change is happening, they actually this year had a very catastrophic effect on Russian agriculture. And the stuff that was happening in spring, when everything got warmer too soon and then the frosts hit again at the end of spring, this actually had a very severe blow on the crops growing this year. Because the mechanics of this is that after we gather crops, all these winter and some early spring months, we can fare on our own crops that we have grown, mostly on all the grains and veggies and even some fruit. We have enough. But right now, we'll be running out of them. So these seasonal price spikes in spring, they're usually related to the fact that we've eaten through our own supplies and we're importing foreign goods to survive to the next season. This year, it likely will hit much sooner on many positions, including potatoes. That's why the price is already growing by 65%, because the harvest was very poor. And you can already see these problems coming up in October, November. So in winter, we'll be facing the significant price growth on all the crops and veggies that were affected by harvesting issues this year. And I'm expecting more spikes in agriculture during the next several weeks. So yeah, bread, veggies, fruit, all that resulting from the bad harvest will be reflected in the price points on these products, even before the new year and way long before the new season starts. You know, Vlad, another thing, not even waiting for the new year, Russian railroads are increasing their tariffs. They're usually doing it at the beginning of the year, or maybe they're doing a review somewhere 6 months in. And now in the middle of autumn, they decided to, actually since December, I think, they started to rise the tariffs very uncomfortably for people, because people often travel and use railroad to see places, maybe see their relatives before the holidays or on holidays. Also, cargo grows, transportation grows before the holidays. So why did they rise the costs in railroad? Well, it talks about several things. First of all, if you look at what's happening in Russian railroads, the main railroad news that we have in Russia these days is significant traffic jam, actually pretty wild traffic jam from Urals to the very far east, because roughly about 85% of Russia and 85% of GDP of Russia is being produced, and people live in the European part of the country, including Urals and some of the Western Siberia. And this is very far from China, which became our main trade partner. And the main load, of course, falls on the railroad ways, and it's failing to carry it, completely failing. And it's now getting even worse. Well, connected with the news from another industry, this active import of everything we can from North Korea, from weapons and ammo to even soldiers, this goes in a different direction, right? So when military cargo, military things get transported on the railroad, they actually slow down every other transportation. They get premium, they get priority, and everything else gets slowed down. So nothing fits in that segment of the railroad between the Urals and China. And we also can see that because of the load on the railroad cars and the demand that increased significantly, they're facing a lot of deficit. A lot of things are falling apart. They need new cars, they need new fitting platforms. So because of reorientation to the east, the load on a relatively slow and low capacity of railroad needs to be expanded. But for that, you need a lot of money. And understandably, Russian railroads are not going to any international financial market looking at the sanctions and all. So they can only take money from the budget, which is actually giving them a lot of subsidies, or by increasing the tariffs. So this tariff increase by railroads, this is a direct pay for so-called turn to the east that needs more trillions, that needs more money to expand the railroad capacity, which Russia does not have in this direction. Also, you're saying that why are they doing this tariff rise right now? Why they're not waiting for the new year or the next year? Well, because they need these investments today. That's the simple answer. If they don't rise these tariffs now, they need to take credits in bank on these crazy rates that currently permeate the banking industry. So previously, about half a year ago, everybody were hoping that the rate of a central bank, and with it the rates of other bank credits, would be falling down in the second half of this year. But in reality, we see that it's in reverse. That's why Railroad suggested, they actually offered a government two options. They said we can either increase tariffs later, but then there will be a much higher, much more drastic increase. If you want to give us a bit less money, then give us an option to rise tariffs immediately without waiting for the new year. And this is in direct relation that the high rate of central bank and credits, so if they wait with increasing the tariffs, they'll have to borrow more money and spend more money on the credits. They want to minimize these expenses, and they're increasing tariffs right now. But the overall message is that we're paying for this turn to the east, because the increase of railroad capacity in that direction requires some enormous sums of money. And that's basically what they're funding with these monies. An interesting situation that is being observed with some interest in Beijing and China. I'm curious, what do Chinese partners think about that? I think one of the main areas where Moscow and Beijing are cooperating is food items. And when we see that Russian situation with food is not so well, then perhaps there'll be more things affected by terms that Chinese side is slapping on trade with Russia. We're not quite sure about the details of the agreements, what Putin and Xi have figured out. Well, we generally know. We saw the discounts, multi-billion-dollar discounts there, And Sechin recently was making a speech at some forum, you can find it online. He said that Russia basically lost from 14 to 16 billion dollars by exporting oil to China. So this is him telling the story that China actually got more profits from Russia on the prices that are very different from suppliers from other countries. This is a whole championship by how do you formulate a statement and to make it sound nice and to not get on Putin's radar. How do you say something that is true and yet mimic it to sound nice? Right, so discounts are huge. There's also another problem with China, and our relations with China are indeed very complex, so that friendship, it only exists on the TV. In reality, and you can, again, look it up online, starting this year, China slapped import duties on Russian coal from 3 to 6%. So while we're discussing how Donald Trump will come and do more customs duties against Chinese goods, China is already slapping duties against Russian products. They are increasing the tariffs on Russian coal because their economy was slowed down, so the demand for steel is going down. And instead of consumer of steel, China became the exporter of steel. And they are competing with Russian steel and giving a lot of grief to Russian metallurgy, which is actually screaming because of Chinese intervention in the international steel market. And for example, such main pillars of some grains that Russia could export. This actually some of our oats and some other stuff that we could export aplenty. China is not opening their market to us completely. They're only taking a small fraction for some of the grains. Only this year they opened the market for Russian pork coming to China. It was closed up until now. And during the 9 months, they only bought 30,000 tons. This is less than 15% overall Russian pork exports throughout the world. So our relations with China is very complicated, and their market is generally closed for Russian goods. Another interesting element, you can also Google online, type up Russian Economic Forum that happened at the beginning of November in Chelyabinsk. They're mostly posting them in RuTube, but on our channel, I'll put a few things, on my channel, I'll put a few excerpts. And all the industrialists are talking about wild competition with Chinese manufacturers, which our manufacturers are failing to compete with. And the reasons are that Chinese central bank had 3.5% rate, and at the end of October, they lowered it down to 3.1. So their credit available for manufacturer is maybe 5 to 6%, at 5 to 6% credit. Can you imagine that? Our manufacturers are screaming, saying we cannot compete with Chinese production when their rate is 5 and our rate is 25. And it's very interesting. For my channel, I'll make a few cutouts from that forum. That's why, in general, if you look objectively, China is looking more as a competitor and economic contender that doesn't allow us to their markets, demands discounts on the goods that we try to sell them. Chinese companies are pushing Russian companies from the market, and in Russia, economists and businessmen are talking about that in the open already. So all this favorable partnership is only for the birds, is only for the pretty TV picture. If you start digging deeper, there's a lot of contradictions that need to be solved. You're talking about coal, right? Russia also has issues with coal. Media is saying that one of the scariest crisis in the coal industry is about to hit the country. So something is very much reminiscent of the 90s. Remember the protests of the coal miners and the protests on the Kremlin, at the Red Square, and the social unrest related to it. Right, you know, when there was a presidential campaign of Alexei Navalny back in 2017, I was in Kemerovo with a presentation that was titled "The Coal is Dying," and I was saying that our coal regions, first of all, Kuznetsky Basin, they need to prepare to such a crisis in advance. Why? Because today their main market is China, and China is the mostly capricious market for Russian coal. First of all, it's unclear what is happening with their economy. It is definitely slowing down. Second, they have a lot of their own coal mining, and they import coal only for what is not covered by their own production. So this is essentially a buyer's market, and they can dictate their prices and terms to different suppliers who are looking for a way to tap into Chinese market, to all Indonesia, Australia, and Russia recently. And we know that they definitely told us to make big discounts for them if we want to sell coal to China. Also, regarding logistics, it's very expensive to bring coal to China, because right now Russian coal has over 50% in its price, the cost of logistics. This is one of the story. One of the lines going to the east is actually stuck with coal, because you cannot bring it to China by any other road. And the physical volumes are gigantic. So it does eat up a lot of capacity. And on one hand, it becomes expensive. And on the other hand, China is also slapping tariffs and demands discounts. Why they're adding tariffs is that because due to the slowdown of the Chinese economy, they have to adapt to that competition to their own manufacturers of coal, and Chinese coal miners were lobbying these tariffs on the foreign coals in China. And that market that looked more or less competitive, lukewarm, interesting for Russian coal suppliers in the best years. In the bad years, it became really questionable. That was told to the coal regions years ago, and they had to take certain measures to diversify their economy, because coal will become not a profitable good very soon. And you're correct, remembering the end of the 80s, early 90s in the Soviet Union. We are in a second season of that same story. I don't know what they will be doing with the coal industry in Russia. It does not have big perspectives. This will be a serious issue for the Russian government to solve, including the social pressure, because in the coal mining regions, of course, in Kuznetsky Basin, they just don't have any other economy. There's no other job. There are no other options for people to earn their living. So where will they put these people to? Indeed, at the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, there was a serious social problem. And I think we're viewing the second season, just as I said. Because objectively, coal mining industry has no good perspectives. You always hear in the news that they are suffering losses, that they cannot sell it, that Chinese terms are not favorable, and we've been looking at all these headlines today. Speaking in general, in Russia, are there any industries, any parts of the economy that feel themselves all right if we don't take military production and maybe metallurgy that serves them? What else? Banks. Banks are feeling themselves just fine. And that, again, is a consequence of conscious regulatory policies of central bank. They're so afraid of the banking system collapse in Russia. And indeed, the banking collapse is a rather deadly proposition for the country. We've seen it several times. When the bank sphere is blocked, the whole economy stagnates and stalls. So this is like a blood system for the economy. But I think they're overusing some medications in this case, and they're allowing Russian banks to add additional tax on the Russian economy, so to speak, because they absolutely earn $1 million. Central bank prognosticated that overall profit of bank sector will be almost 4 trillion rubles, 3.8. I have no good words. There could be children watching or young people watching the stream. I have no good words to describe that policy. If you look at this report, it's called the Review of the Banking Sector. Their margin now is at 5%. So we're discussing the rate of central bank, right, and blaming that 21, and they may rise it higher. But if you take a credit in any bank, you need to understand that, for example, you're taking it at 25%. 5% would be going as a pure profit to the bank that you're taking the money from. Bank sector has never seen such a margin anywhere in the world, as far as I know. In the West, the profitability of the bank sector, normal profitability, is about 0.5%. 0.5, not 5, right? So we also see that a very significant portion of their profit is pure commission income. This is the topic that people keep complaining about, and even were asking Putin at his meetings and direct lines about continuously growing bank commissions in the country. If I'm not mistaken, out of these 4 trillion profits, about a trillion or 7 to 8 billion rubles is pure from commission income. So profits from increasing banking commissions for any service they provide. Why can they do it? Is because the bank system in Russia is essentially a cartel of several big banks. So basically 5 large banks are controlling 2/3 of the banking system. And they can just call each other and make certain arrangements about their behavior and strategic points and act as a cartel on this market. That's why on the backdrop of the economy that's lying and not breathing, or barely, is a banking system is feeling fine. Even Nabiullina, when she was visiting the Congress at the end of October, she was saying that, Russian Congress, she was saying that, what are you doing? Why are you allowing banks to profit so much? So you asked me, who's living well in Russia? So besides the oil industry and metallurgy, traditionally, there is also a banking sector. And the several recent years military production is also another one. And I want to say, if you look at the profits of Russian companies at large, about 3/4 of profits are concentrated in about a handful of sectors that are export-oriented, military, or banking system. Everything else, all the rest of Russian economy is at zero profitability or even with negative. But there are some branches that feel themselves fine, as we see. Can you advise Russians to use or not use banking services? How to save money? Do they keep money on the deposits? Well, look, the story with deposits is very risky, as everything that is related with long-term relations with banks. We saw how at the beginning of the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, they've assassinated the hard currency accounts. They were not bringing much profits to Russians, but they seemed to be something safe. They were some sort of a safe haven. But we see that the money that were there, they are being frozen, they're being stigmatized, there are additional commissions slapped on those. So it would be unprofitable to keep money in currencies. And people are losing everything in those accounts, or slowly losing the value. I think with ruble deposits, there is one very big risk. Look, what's the official ideology of Russian central bank when they're raising the key rate? They want to take the excessive cash from the economy, which they think is excessive, reasonably thinking so. There are other reasons for the money to be there, but they want them to be on the deposits. So you need to make deposits profitable so that people would put the money on the deposits, would not be spending this money and exacerbating inflation, but rather would put them in a bank. But here's the question. At some point, there will be a point, inevitably, when the rate will start going down and deposits will become less attractive. What will be happening with these deposits? People will go en masse to take their money out of the bank system. And these monies that they've saved from injecting into the economic turnover, and they were sterilized at the bank deposits, they will go back into economy. And you will see what? You will see a serious influence on that same inflation that we're talking about. That's why, there was a very important moment in the late USSR. Remember, there was Pavlov money reform in January of 1991, when everybody remembers how 100 ruble bills were exchanged. And they did the other thing during this reform. They limited how much money could you withdraw from the bank account, up to, I think, 500 a month. So this all looks like a free cheese today with all these deposits offers. But we all know where free cheese is, right? That's why I would take it with a serious grain of salt. If the policies of central bank will change and the percent on those deposits will go down, there'll be a significant outflow of your money from the deposits back into economy. And all of a sudden you may discover that your deposit is not really owned by you to a degree that you think. That's why I would suggest to be very careful. Regarding recommendations, I'm trying to be, again, encompassing of different things, and that therefore I have to be a bit more careful. But I'd suggest keep currency in cash on hand. I understand it may not be safe for some regions or some Russians, but overall, using bank system will likely lead you to losing a lot more money in tariffs, in other fees, and eventually there may be a hurdle to even withdraw your money. And there are no easy way out. However much Putin's government is trying to fortify ruble, we see that the trend is into weakening. That's why if you're buying currency today and storing it in cash, in some time you'll win. Maybe not in 2 months, but in a year you definitely will, because ruble is on the declining trend. And I don't see any good alternatives to the cash, to the hard currency in cash. Those people who are advertising investments into shares and stock markets, you're seeing what's happening with Russian stock market since they're spring maximums. So far, from the saving capability or somewhat a good way to save money, there is no easy alternative to hard currency like dollar or euro. I'm not seeing that. Well, Minister Silvanov is not in agreement with you in regards to dollar. He's saying that they do not need dollar. You probably saw that interview, rather groundbreaking. And can you comment it? Why is he of such an opinion? Why Silvanov is so afraid of American currency? Well, this is not more than a declaration, and I recommend to not listen to just statements, but to look at two numbers if we're talking about the demand for currencies. Only two numbers matter. First is the share of this currency in the international markets and the share of these currencies in the global reserves of central banks of different countries. We see everywhere that dollar feels itself absolutely well. Their share is 50 plus and higher. And we see that however much Russia is trying to invent some alchemy around alternative currency with BRICS countries, over 90% of international payments and over 90% of international reserve currencies are dollar, euro, Japanese yen, Swiss franc, and British pound, and maybe Canadian, Australian dollars to some degree. So these are the countries of the big seven plus Switzerland and Australia. And this has not been changing for years. There is no other dynamic in this. The share of yuan, Chinese yuan, slightly grew, but it grew microscopically, still by single percents, and mostly because of Russia, because Russia became the market that is actively using Chinese currency, and central bank is using it in its reserves. There is no other currency, and besides yuan, these countries of the global south, they do not have anything relatively liquid, no other currency that they can offer. And even yuan is limited because Chinese central bank and banks, they do not like their currency to be used uncontrollably beyond the borders of China. So for example, Chinese banks, for their agents, they actually limited the amount of Chinese currency that Russian banks can purchase. So Russia is using the yuans that they already have accumulated before that limit was implemented. There's no other group of liquid currencies. And actually, dollar and euro, they're the leaders. They're over 70% in this overall international basket. If anything would be really happening and changing, and the demand for dollar and euro will decline, you will see that. But so far, in many years of talks, the data shows that however they were in high demand, they're still in high demand. These are liquid currencies that have all the benefits, all the advantages. They're not limited in any use in any way. They're not supported by some small economies. They're supported by big, well-developed economies of United States and the economy of European Union. So all these threats about dollar, these are just conversations. There are no threats to dollar, really. A dollar at 150 rubles, you think it's reality or science fiction? I think in foreseeable future, we will see that. I cannot say, give you exact date. You know, these dates, people want dates, but it's difficult with dates. So we can see that ruble is still repetitively going down to 100 per dollar, regardless of how much it is pushed to be strengthened. The tendency is so that it will likely break through and will continue going beyond 100. And then the moment we see any big difficulties in economy, I saw the discussion between the analysts on the Russian investments market. They were saying that whenever we have a difficult time, everything is difficult, everything is bad with oil, with ruble, with inflation. So it hits us on all the fronts. Very often it collides at the same point. And we can remember all the shocks that our economy went through in the recent 15 to 20 years. So every time when there is a serious shock situation, a serious drastic fall of ruble is definitely one of the factors that we're observing. So if anything like that happens, and I think the trend is going there, the government is running out of money, they cannot upkeep the budget in such a deficit, they will need to somehow limit their expenses. They will need to limit the military expenses too. Inflation continues to grow, and it's a huge holding factor for Russian economy, and central bank is failing to do anything about it. So 2025 becomes a very difficult point for them, the focal point for all these issues. And I'm thinking it likely will join in some point, and likely, for example, there may be some other black swans like oil going cheaper. What is the next barrier for ruble? Right now it's 100. Well, the next one will be 150, right? Maybe 200. So per dollar. With any significant crisis, ruble will be testing these minimums. So this is a rather realistic number that we may see in the foreseeable future. What do you think it will end with, Vladimir? Economic crisis in Russia? Well, I keep bringing the analogies of 1980s, when people are waiting for something, single moment to happen. And this moment is usually happening after a long preparatory process. We saw how throughout 1980s, Soviet economy was rotting. It was obvious that it was going to some finale. That was unpredictable, not exactly seen. We've been discussing with economic colleagues here. And if, for example, Gorbachev would have decided to shrink military expenses, they would have carried on for quite a while, but they were stubborn enough. So still, all the indicators were showing that everything goes to a certain point where serious changes were needed. Otherwise, this system will not be able to continue. And we are going to such a point now. As a result of 3 years of the war with Ukraine, we can see that Russia failed as economic system. Russia failed to create an economy that would be based on a strong import replacement, on strong partnership with China that would have flown high and would soar without the West. Russia failed to do that. There was rebound that ended with slowdown. And after the first initial rebound, we are on the decline. And there is no perspective. There are no investments, no technologies. We're still cut off from the world. And there are some resources, perhaps, to maintain ourselves for a while, like Soviet Union could in the 80s, but the trend is definitely going, and understandable. We are diving deep, we're not soaring high. How long it will go for, it's difficult to forecast. But what I'm seeing in recent time is that official rhetoric is changing significantly. Half a year ago, it was very self-assured on many criteria. There are some people who are criticizing the current situation, but there were a lot of people who are saying, no, we'll deal with it. We have some investments growing, we're looking for new markets, we're doing some innovation, we're still replacing some of the imports. This is all not seen already. Listen to any forum, business, economic forum that are happening in Russia. There was one recently in Chelyabinsk. At the end of November, there'll be Russian industrialists' annual gathering, and just listen to their statements, listen what they're talking about. It's all rather gloom. And financial baskets are empty, nothing you can do with inflation. Competition with China is harsh. Only budgetary money that can save the situation, but they're running out. And deficit is additional factor that grows the inflation. So how in about 6 months these estimations as a collective statements from industries, how much they have changed the tone, how much darker they are now. I want to say that 2025 will likely be very interesting, and I hope it will bring something new. So, you know, when the plane is going from one airport to another, it doesn't take a direct approach, right? It goes through certain waypoints. It gets to a certain waypoint and then adjusts the course. So I think we're about to see that very large-scale waypoint where all the hopes for Russian economy to stand on its own legs despite the sanctions, where everybody will finally understand that they are for naught, and unless we change something, we'll have to wait till the end. And how long can Putin can protract the current situation with the current resources? That's an interesting question. But I think in 2025 we'll see that perspective clearly. There is nowhere to go. We're that Flying Dutchman without an engine and without a team. And how much more afloat will stay? That's a good question. But there is no option unless the big changes are made. We would like to end on some good note here. Could you imagine new democratic Russia? And maybe you would be invited to design the banknote of a new ruble. Whom or what would you suggest to depict on this note? Well, you know, I made a few videos before about the image of the future of Russia, which I think needs to be significantly altered. I brought a simple analogy. There are only two very similar countries in the world who also looks very much like Russia. Northern country with a lot of territory, oil and gas. Canada, right? Canada. So go to a Canadian souvenir shop if you're just visiting as a tourist, and you will see that everything is pretty, everything is green, red, moose, fir trees, bears, maple leaves, and go to the Russian gift shop. Stalin, Putin, tanks, war, something Orthodox religion related. I think in our symbolism, we need to start going to something more peaceful. We have a lot of beautiful things in the country: nature, kids, art, literature, poetry. The color should also change. It should also be happier, and we need to remove all these aggressive color combinations that we have now. So I would not suggest this some final design, but I'm just suggesting a vector that Russia can go to many good peaceful things that Russia has that is not related with war, with militarism, with centralized government, with some government actors of the past that were capturing foreign lands and were building despotic centralized systems. We need to get rid of that and put more kids, more art, more nature. I think this is not only about currency, but this is in general about government symbolism in Russia. I think this is where we should go. Vladimir Milov, politician, economist, thank you so much for your conversation. Thank you likewise.